On a bright summer afternoon, the golden sunlight shimmered over the lush green lawns of an upscale neighborhood in Dallas, Texas. James Turner, a former police officer with 18 years of service, reclined on a lounge chair by the pool in his backyard, enjoying an ice-cold beer. After years of hard work, he had finally purchased his dream home, a spacious two-story house with a beautifully landscaped yard and a private swimming pool. To James, this wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of his dedication and success. As he closed his eyes, savoring the peaceful moment, the sudden blare of police sirens shattered the tranquility. James sat up, looking toward the front of his house. Two patrol cars screeched to a stop, their red and blue lights flashing. A police officer stepped out, hand resting on his holster, his gaze cautious. "Sir, we received a report about a suspicious individual acting strangely in this area," the officer stated firmly. James frowned, his heartbeat pounding with frustration. He took a deep breath, keeping his composure, then slowly stood up. "This is my house," he said, his voice calm but firm. He pulled his keys from his pocket, shaking them in his hand. "I've lived here for 2 weeks." The officer hesitated slightly, but James's unwavering stare held his ground. At that moment, a curtain on the second floor of the neighboring house shifted. A familiar figure peeked out, Mary, the neighbor who had called the cops. And this was only the beginning of the trouble she was about to cause. James Turner had worked his entire life for this moment. After 18 years of dedicated service as a police officer, countless overtime shifts, and years of disciplined saving, he had finally purchased his dream home, a beautiful two-story house in an affluent neighborhood in Dallas, Texas. From the moment he stepped through the front door, he knew this wasn't just a house. It was proof that hard work and perseverance paid off. The first few days in his new home were filled with excitement. He spent his time arranging furniture, setting up his home office, and, his favorite part, preparing his backyard for the summer. The private swimming pool had been one of the main reasons he bought the house. Its crystal-clear water sparkled under the Texas sun, and he imagined spending countless peaceful afternoons unwinding after years of chasing criminals and breaking up street fights. But peace was short-lived. It started subtly at first. While setting up his patio furniture one afternoon, James caught a glimpse of his neighbor, Mary Whitman, staring at him from her second-floor window. She was an older woman, dressed impeccably in a crisp white blouse and pearl earrings, the kind of person who always seemed to be watching everything around her. When James waved, she quickly disappeared behind the curtain. He brushed it off, assuming she was just a nosy neighbor. The next day, while James was out picking up supplies, his phone buzzed with a security camera alert. Curious, he checked the footage. What he saw made his blood boil. There was Mary strolling into his backyard like she owned the place. She wasn't alone. She carried an expensive beach towel and a wide-brimmed sun hat, making herself comfortable on one of his lounge chairs. Then, as if this were a luxury resort rather than someone's private property, she dipped her feet into the pool, a satisfied smile on her face. By the time James returned home, she was gone. But when he confronted her later, her response was infuriating. "Oh," she gasped, feigning surprise with a hand to her chest. "I thought you were the new pool maintenance guy. The previous owners always let me use the pool." James clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not the maintenance guy. I'm the new owner," he said firmly. "And I'd appreciate it if you asked permission before stepping onto my property." Mary's polite mask slipped for just a second, replaced by a look of disbelief. She let out a short, nervous laugh. "You, the owner?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "There must be some mistake. I know the real estate agent who handled this sale, and she never mentioned." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely at him, leaving the unspoken implication hanging in the air. James exhaled slowly, counting to 10 in his head. He had dealt with difficult people before, liars, criminals, manipulators. He recognized the game she was playing. "There's no mistake, Mrs. Whitman," he said, his voice cool and unwavering. "This is my home. And you're trespassing. Please leave." Mary muttered something under her breath as she gathered her things, but just before stepping back into her own yard, she cast him one last glance, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "We'll see about that," she murmured. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. James had dealt with all kinds of people during his years on the force. Thieves, liars, manipulators, but nothing could have prepared him for the audacity of Mary Whitman. He had thought that their last conversation settled things. He had made it clear that this was his home, his property, and that she had no right to be there without his permission. But the look she had given him before walking away, that smug, knowing smirk, left an uneasy feeling in his gut. And as it turned out, his instincts had been right. The next morning, James stepped outside to get his mail and was immediately met with an unpleasant sight. Mary standing on the sidewalk with two other neighbors, whispering in hushed tones while occasionally glancing his way. As soon as he made eye contact, they stopped talking, their expressions shifting into something cold and scrutinizing. Shaking off the irritation, James grabbed his mail and went inside, but his frustration only grew when he sorted through the envelopes. One in particular caught his eye, a notice from the Homeowners Association. With a sinking feeling, he tore it open and scanned the contents. Dear Mr. Turner, it has come to our attention that there have been complaints regarding your occupancy of the property at address. As per the HOA guidelines, we must ensure that all residents adhere to community standards and regulations. Please be advised that a review of your residency status is underway. James clenched his fists, his pulse quickening. Complaints? A review of his residency status? What the hell was this? He had gone through all the legal channels, signed the paperwork, and paid for this house fair and square. There was nothing to review. Anger simmered beneath his skin as he reread the letter. There was no doubt in his mind who was behind this. Mary? She had made it clear from the start that she didn't believe he belonged here, and now she was using whatever influence she had to make his life miserable. That afternoon, James decided to confront her again. He walked over to her house and knocked firmly on the door. A few seconds later she opened it, her expression neutral, almost amused. "Oh, Mr. Turner," she said sweetly. "What a surprise." James held up the letter. "Care to explain this?" She glanced at it and let out a small, theatrical gasp. "Oh dear. That's unfortunate. But you see, our community has very high standards and some of the residents were concerned. I had no choice but to raise the issue with the HOA." James took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You and I both know this has nothing to do with community standards." Mary tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "Well, James, some people just don't fit in here. Maybe it would be best if you started looking elsewhere." James's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was a battle, and he wasn't about to back down. James had faced plenty of challenges in his life, but never had he felt so cornered, so outright targeted as he did now. Mary and her allies had escalated their efforts, turning the neighborhood against him in ways both subtle and blatant. It wasn't just the HOA notice anymore. His mail was suddenly arriving late or not at all, his trash bins were mysteriously knocked over every morning, and cold, judgmental stares followed him wherever he went. The final straw came when he received another letter, this one more direct, more hostile. "Mr. Turner, due to multiple complaints regarding disturbances and non-compliance with community standards, the Homeowners Association will be holding a formal hearing to review your status as a resident. Failure to attend may result in further action, including potential eviction proceedings." James stared at the paper, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. Eviction? From his own home? How was this even possible? He had every legal right to be here. Yet, Mary was determined to twist the system, to manipulate the rules just enough to make his life unbearable. He needed to act. Fast. That evening, James dug through every document he had. His deed, his purchase records, the HOA agreement. He highlighted clauses, flagged inconsistencies, and made sure he had every piece of evidence in his favor. If they were going to put him on trial, he would be ready. But as he prepared for the hearing, something unexpected happened. A knock at his door, firm but hesitant. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with David, one of the newer residents. Unlike the others, David didn't have that same cold, judgmental glare. Instead, he looked uneasy. "Hey, can we talk?" James studied him for a moment before stepping aside, letting him in. David hesitated before speaking. "Look, I don't agree with what's happening to you. Mary, she's been telling everyone that you, don't belong here. That you must have found some loophole to buy the place. She's spreading rumors, convincing people that you're the problem when really," he exhaled sharply. "This is all her." James clenched his jaw. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only fueled his anger. David continued, "I don't know if you have a lawyer, but you might need one. She's got the HOA wrapped around her finger. If they're coming for you, they're going to make it as hard as possible." James nodded, his mind already working. He had hoped to fight this battle alone, but now, maybe he didn't have to. Maybe there were others who saw through Mary's lies, others who were just too afraid to speak up, until now. One thing was clear, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice. And he was ready for war. James had never felt so determined in his life. The hearing was set, and he knew this was his last chance to fight back against Mary and her web of lies. With David's warning fresh in his mind, he spent the next few days preparing. He contacted a lawyer, gathered every document he could, and even managed to find old records of past complaints Mary had filed against other residents. Proof that he wasn't the first person she had tried to push out. The night before the hearing, James received an anonymous email. It contained scanned copies of internal HOA communications, emails between Mary and several board members discussing their plans to remove him. In one particularly damning message, Mary blatantly wrote, "We need to make sure James Turner is gone. If the current rules don't work, we change them. No exceptions." James gritted his teeth. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. This was corruption at its core. Armed with the truth, he stepped into the hearing room the next day, his head held high. The HOA board sat in a row, Mary in the center like a queen presiding over her court. The room was filled with residents, some whispering, others glaring. James wasn't sure if they were here to see him fall or to finally witness justice. Mary was the first to speak. "James Turner has been a disruptive presence in this community. He has failed to adhere to HOA regulations, disregarded multiple warnings and—" James stood. "I'd like to respond to that." His voice was calm but firm. He placed a thick folder of documents on the table. "Everything you've accused me of? I have proof that it's false. More importantly, I have proof that this is nothing more than a personal attack." He handed out copies of the HOA emails. The moment Mary saw them, her face paled. Whispers erupted in the room as the board members read through the documents. A man in the back stood up, an older resident, Mr. Lawson. This is outrageous. You mean to tell me our own HOA has been conspiring to remove a homeowner?" James nodded. "Mary has done this before. I have records of other residents she targeted. People who either left or gave up fighting." He turned to the board. "How much longer are you going to let this continue?" For the first time, Mary looked shaken. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, another board member, a woman who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "This hearing is over. James Turner is a rightful resident of this community, and we will be reviewing Mary's actions immediately." A stunned silence filled the room before it erupted into murmurs. Mary clenched her jaw, but she knew she had lost. James exhaled, feeling the weight finally lift. Justice had won. But as he looked at Mary's cold, calculating stare, he knew one thing for certain. This war wasn't over yet. That evening, James sat on his porch, sipping a cold beer as the sun dipped below the horizon. The hearing had gone in his favor, but he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Mary wasn't the type to back down easily. Even as she left the meeting room, her glare had promised retaliation. His phone buzzed. "David. Man, you really shook things up today. The whole neighborhood is talking about it." James let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, but I doubt Mary's done. She's too invested in her power to just walk away." David sighed. "You're right. Be careful. She won't play fair." James had no doubt about that. He spent the next few days cautiously watching his surroundings. Small things started happening. His trash cans were mysteriously overturned, he received sudden fines from the HOA for violations that didn't exist, and a complaint was filed against him for aggressive behavior during the hearing. It was clear, Mary was already striking back. But James wasn't alone anymore. Residents who had once stayed silent began reaching out. Mr. Lawson, the older resident who spoke up at the hearing, knocked on his door with a cup of coffee. "You're not the only one she's bullied," he admitted. "Maybe it's time we fight back, together?" James nodded, a slow determination settling in. Mary might have ruled this neighborhood unchecked for years, but her reign was coming to an end. And this time she wouldn't just be facing him, she'd be facing all the people she had wronged. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, James felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.